The courtroom laughed when Elijah Brooks stood up. Just 12 years old. No suit, no lawyer, just a child holding a crumpled folder. The judge smirked. The prosecutor rolled his eyes. His grandmother Thelma stood alone, accused of stealing $70,000 from the housing fund she spent her life building. But Elijah didn't flinch. He walked to the front, looked the judge dead in the eye, and said, "I can prove who really stole the money." What happened next wiped the smiles off every face in that courtroom, because within minutes this little boy did what no one saw coming. He flipped the entire case upside down. If that gave you chills, hit, share it, and stay with us. You're not ready for what comes next. The courtroom was already heavy with silence when the voice of a 12-year-old boy broke through. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried something sharper than volume conviction. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Heads turned slowly. The murmurs started. Spectators shifted in their seats. At the far end of the gallery, Elijah Brooks stood with both hands gripping a worn manila folder, eyes steady, chest rising just a little too fast for someone pretending to be calm. Judge Marlowe didn't look up. He was scribbling notes with deliberate detachment, as if a child's voice wasn't even worth the ink in his pen. "You may sit down," the judge said flatly. "This is not a classroom drama. This is a court of law." Elijah didn't move, not yet. From the prosecution table, Daniel Keene, tall, sharp-jawed, the type who smiled only when he smelled victory, didn't bother to hide his smirk. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, and muttered just loud enough for the court reporter to hear. He should be in class, not court. A few jurors chuckled. One woman shifted uncomfortably. She didn't like the way the laughter sounded, too thin, too mean. But Elijah's voice didn't waver. He stepped forward 1 foot. Just one. "I'm not here to argue law," he said slowly, deliberately. "I'm here to protect the only person who ever protected me." Now Judge Marlowe looked up. His expression was unreadable, a mask carved from 30 years of handing out sentences like clockwork. But something behind his eyes flickered just for a moment when he realized the boy was speaking not in defiance, but in desperation. "Thelma Brooks is your grandmother?" the judge asked, though the answer was obvious. "Yes, sir," Elijah replied. "Then you should know better. This is not the place for theatrics. We don't take speeches from children, especially not when a serious charge is on the table." He tapped the thick case file with the back of his pen. Once. Twice. As if the weight of those pages was supposed to crush the boy where he stood. Thelma, sitting beside her court-appointed attorney, who had barely spoken all morning, tried to turn, but a bailiff gave her a look. Her eyes filled, but she said nothing. She had taught Elijah better than to interrupt the powerful, but she had also taught him to never look away from injustice, not even when it stared back in a black robe. Keene stood now, brushing invisible lint off his expensive gray suit. "Your Honor, this is clearly a stunt, an emotional distraction. Let's not allow this trial to turn into a circus." "A circus?" Elijah said suddenly, his voice louder than he intended. "Is it a circus when a black woman who built a housing program for 20 years is accused without real evidence? Is it a circus when no one questions how the money actually disappeared? They just assume she did it because she's old and black and alone." The silence that followed was not like before. It was different now. Heavier. Tense. Judge Marlowe's jaw tightened. "You are out of line," he said. Elijah didn't flinch. He stepped another foot forward, the manila folder now trembling slightly in his hands. "I know I'm 12. I know I don't belong here. But my grandmother didn't deserve to be left here alone either. Her lawyer quit because she couldn't pay. And no one, not the police, not the investigators, not even this court has tried to understand what really happened." Keene laughed softly. "Oh, so now we're being lectured by a middle schooler. What's next?" "Your honor story time." Elijah turned to him, and for the first time the boy's calm cracked not with fear, but with fire. "You don't get to laugh at me. You don't know what it's like to come home and find the only person who loves you sitting on the floor crying because the world decided she was guilty without even asking her side." He turned back to the judge, and now his voice was low again. Steady, measured. "All I'm asking for is 5 minutes. Not as a lawyer, not as a witness, just as a grandson who knows the truth." Judge Marlowe leaned back in his chair. His face was unreadable again. But something about the boy's presence, the weight in his words, made the courtroom forget his age, if only for a breath. The judge looked to Keene, who raised his eyebrows as if to say, "You're not actually considering this." Then to the jurors. Some were still watching Elijah, not with amusement now, but with something closer to respect. Judge Marlowe exhaled slowly. "You have exactly 5 minutes. One word too many and you're removed." Elijah nodded once, not like a child obeying authority, but like someone accepting a challenge. And as he stepped fully forward, laying his folder on the table and flipping it open with care. No one in the courtroom, not the bailiff, not the jury, not even the man who called it a stunt, had any idea what was coming next. Because what they all failed to see was that Elijah Brooks didn't come to play. He came to fight, and he came prepared. Elijah didn't flinch when Judge Marlowe tried to silence him. Instead, he took a slow breath, lowered his eyes to the folder in his hand, and opened it with a care that spoke volumes. The courtroom quieted curiosity now tinged with discomfort. He wasn't performing. He wasn't pleading. He was remembering. "My parents were on their way to my school play," Elijah said, voice steady but eyes beginning to glaze. It was the first time they both promised to come. "I waited in costume until they called my name twice. Then I heard the sirens outside." There was no need for drama. The silence in that room did more than any violin score ever could. My grandma Thelma took me home from the hospital. I had a cracked rib and a broken heart. She didn't cry in front of me. Not once. She just held my hand and said, "You're staying with me now. We're going to keep each other strong." He paused, eyes lifting. She kept her word. It wasn't just grief he was sharing. It was survival. It was resilience carved into bedtime routines and kitchen tables. Every Sunday night, Elijah continued, we'd sit at the table and go through receipts. I'd color code them yellow for income, blue for expenses. She'd explain where every penny went. Those weren't just bills. They were our stories, our way of surviving. That table became our classroom. He smiled faintly, as if a warmth flickered just behind the pain. We did that for 2 years, even when she was tired, even when I didn't want to. Judge Marlowe cleared her throat sharply. "Mr. Brooks, heartfelt as this may be, the court is not here to indulge in sentiment. None of this is admissible as evidence." The words cut through the air like a cold gust. Elijah didn't argue. He didn't even blink. He just turned back to the jury. "She's not perfect," he said softly. "But she's honest. I've watched her pour herself into a job no one thanked her for. She didn't get paid for running that housing program. She did it because she believed no child should sleep in a hallway like I did the night after the accident." He let the words sit. "She used to say, the world will tell you what you're worth, but don't believe them. Look at your actions, not their opinions." I didn't always understand what she meant, but I do now. Someone coughed in the back. A juror wiped at her cheek discreetly. Across the courtroom, the prosecutor shifted in his seat. "Your grandmother's intentions are not what's on trial," Keene said dryly. "We're talking about $17,500 missing from public funds." Elijah turned to him calmly. "And I'll get to that. But first I need this room to know who she is. Because numbers don't tell the whole story, people do." There it was, the crack in the wall. "I'm not here for pity," he continued, voice firmer now. "I'm here because I've seen people like my grandmother get written off, dismissed, judged before they even speak." He took a single step forward, his feet almost too light to hear. "And I know what some of you are thinking, that I'm too young to understand fraud, that I'm too close to this case to be objective. But if the person who raised me taught me one thing, it's that the truth doesn't care about your age or your skin. It just wants to be heard." Judge Marlowe narrowed her eyes but said nothing this time. The jury leaned forward one by one, almost without realizing it. And so Elijah said, laying one yellow slip gently on the bench, "If you'll let me, I'll show you what we found. Not with emotion, with facts, with timelines, with the same receipts we sorted together. But you have to hear her story first, because if you only look at numbers, you'll miss the one truth that matters." He paused. "She was trying to help. Someone else was trying to hide, and I won't stop until we find out who." The courtroom remained frozen. Even the judge didn't interrupt. Because for the first time, this wasn't just a boy telling a story. It was a witness preparing to reveal the truth. Elijah took another breath, steadied his hands on the folder, then looked to the jury. Not the judge, not the prosecutor, but the people who might still be willing to listen. "I wasn't supposed to be here," he began, voice a little lower now, more cautious than before. Not because I didn't want to be, but because someone tried to make sure I wouldn't. The courtroom tensed ever so slightly. There was something in the way he said it, not dramatic, not loud, but deliberate, heavy. There's a woman sitting in the second row, Patricia Green. Most people in this city know her as a librarian, but before that she worked as a paralegal. She's the one who taught me how to pull records, how to read redacted budgets, how to follow the money. A few heads turned toward the woman in the gallery, modestly dressed, hands folded tightly in her lap. She didn't move, but her eyes were fixed on the boy. She's retired now. But when I told her I wanted to understand the documents in my grandma's case, she offered to help. She came over after church every Sunday, brought pie she never ate, and walked me through every line of those reports. She never treated me like a kid, just like someone trying to find the truth. Elijah paused, then glanced down, almost as if deciding whether to continue. 2 weeks ago, she found a gap in the city's maintenance expense logs. It was small, but wrong. A payment that was marked as approved, but the service it paid for never happened. We thought it might be a clerical error, until someone showed up at her house. You could hear a chair shift slightly in the back. The air changed subtly, like the oxygen had thickened. She didn't tell me right away, just showed up quieter than usual. But I could tell something was wrong. She finally said a man had come to her porch the night before, not someone she knew. He told her to stop helping me. Said if she kept digging, her pension might suddenly get complicated. A soft murmur stirred in the courtroom, too quiet to be called an outburst, too unsettled to ignore. She asked who he worked for. He smiled and said, "The same people who decide which files get shredded." Then he left. Elijah's hands gripped the folder tighter. I asked her if she was scared. She said yes, but then she leaned in, looked me straight in the eye and said, "They threaten you because they fear your mind. Don't let that be the reason you stop." He swallowed. Even now, repeating her words, his voice wavered just slightly, but he pushed through. She gave me this file that day, told me if anything ever happened to her, I had to use it. He raised a single sheet of paper, the same one Patricia had flagged the payment with no matching service report. Then turned back to Judge Marlowe. "I'd like to submit this to the court. It's relevant to the housing fund audit and matches the timeline of the accusation against my grandmother." Judge Marlowe didn't even look at the document. She leaned back in her chair, lips tight, fingers steepled. "Denied. You're not a licensed attorney, Mr. Brooks, and your witness is not on the stand. This is not how evidence is admitted." There was a pause, not from Elijah, from the jury. Eyes that had until now flickered back and forth between the boy and the judge now lingered on Marlowe a little longer. Something had shifted. Not overtly, not enough to make a headline, but enough to be felt. Elijah didn't argue. He placed the document face up on the presentation table gently, like it still mattered even if no one was allowed to see it. He turned to the jurors again. "I'm not asking you to believe me just because I'm young or desperate. I'm asking you to notice who's trying the hardest to shut me up. Because if this case was simple, why would anyone feel threatened by a librarian and a kid with a folder? The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of implications, full of questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Thelma, sitting behind him, had her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had turned pale. Patricia Green sat still, but the corners of her mouth seemed to lift just slightly, not in defiance, but in quiet pride. Judge Marlowe didn't speak for several seconds. When she finally did, it was cold and clipped. "Mr. Brooks, this court will not tolerate baseless accusations or theatrical distractions. If your next statement does not pertain directly to the charges against your grandmother, I will instruct the jury to disregard your testimony entirely." Elijah nodded, not in defeat, but like someone who had expected the response and was already prepared for it. "I understand, Your Honor, but I think the jury can decide for themselves what's relevant." And with that, he stepped back. Just one step. Enough to give the room space to breathe again. Enough to let the tension settle without fading, because the warning had been given, and someone had decided to ignore it. Elijah stepped back toward the center of the courtroom, and this time there was no hesitation in his body. He looked older somehow, not in appearance, but in presence. The weight of what he was about to say had settled into his posture. He opened the folder once more and drew out a separate stack of documents clipped neatly and marked by hand. "I'd like to talk about the money," he began. "The money they say my grandmother stole." He lifted the first page and held it up, walking slowly toward the jury box as he spoke. This is an invoice for a roof repair at 1831 Linwood Avenue, authorized by the Housing Board, paid in full $2,600, dated 4 months ago. He paused, letting them take in the number. I visited that house 3 weeks ago. The roof still leaks. The homeowner showed me buckets in their hallway catching rainwater. The contractor listed here never returned their calls. He handed a photo to the bailiff. In it, the ceiling of a living room sagged visibly, water stains stretching across the plaster like bruises. A date was printed in the corner matching the present day. He didn't wait for a reaction. He moved to the next page. Second transaction. This one for upgraded security cameras at the McMillan complex. 3,000 even. Supposedly installed last December. He passed around a second photo. It showed a rusted, outdated dome camera hanging loose from its mount wires exposed. That picture was taken 2 days ago. Those cameras haven't worked in over a year. A few jurors leaned forward now, brows furrowed. One looked toward the judge, then quickly away. Elijah continued, voice calm, but unmistakably gaining strength. Third and final example. A legal retainer listed under the Community Emergency Response Budget. $2,100. Purpose listed outside legal consultation regarding tenant relocation disputes. The issue is, no attorney was ever contacted. Keene shifted in his seat, visibly irritated now. He folded his arms, then uncrossed them. His lips pressed together so tightly they disappeared. I called every law firm listed in the community contract registry, Elijah said, looking directly at him now. Not one had record of communication, and no minutes from the board mention outside legal counsel for that time period. So either someone forgot to document a legal interaction, or it never happened. He turned back to the jury. These 3 transactions total $7,700. That's nearly half of what they accused my grandmother of mishandling. The room was silent. He laid the final page down gently, as though daring anyone to pick it up and prove him wrong. Keene stood abruptly, his chair screeching back. His voice cut through the stillness. This is absurd. He's a child waving photographs around. These aren't verified. They're hearsay. We have processes for a reason. But the courtroom no longer looked at him the same way. Even Judge Marlowe paused before responding, as if measuring her words more carefully than before. Elijah didn't flinch. He let Keene's voice hang for a beat, then addressed the jury again. You don't have to take my word for it. I've submitted these photographs along with signed statements from the residents. You can call them if you want. I just ask that you look at the facts and ask yourself, does any of this sound like the actions of a woman trying to steal? His voice dropped softer now, but no less sharp. Someone spent the money, but it wasn't her. He let those words hang not as an accusation, but as a truth that didn't need embellishment. In the gallery, Thelma closed her eyes just for a moment, like someone who had been holding her breath for weeks and finally exhaled. Keene sat back down, his mouth a tight line. One of the jurors leaned toward another and whispered something, eyes still fixed on Elijah. And though no one said it out loud, the mood in the room had shifted again. It wasn't just a boy telling a story anymore. It was the moment when doubt began to take root, quiet and powerful in the minds of the people who mattered most. Elijah stepped back into the open space before the jury, holding a folder that looked no different from the others he'd opened before. But something in his eyes had shifted. It wasn't just confidence now, it was resolve, quiet, solid, unshakable. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at the judge or the prosecutor. He looked only at the jury, as if they were the ones he trusted to hear what he was about to say. When I was 10, he began softly. I went through a stretch where I couldn't sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, scared, sweating, sometimes crying without knowing why. My grandmother never made a big deal of it. She just started writing me notes. He pulled one out of the folder and held it up. The paper was worn thin at the edges, the ink faded, but the handwriting was clear. She'd leave them by my bed, folded next to my pillow. Just a sentence or two. Something kind, something steady. She'd sign her name at the bottom every time. He glanced down at the paper in his hands. I didn't tell her I was saving them. I didn't tell anyone, but I kept every single one. There was no embellishment in his tone, no performance. He was simply remembering something that mattered. He opened the folder and pulled out a second document. This is the signature used to authorize a $4,000 withdrawal from the Community Support Fund last January. It's being used as part of the case against my grandmother. He held both pages side by side, then gave them to the bailiff to pass to the jury. I'd like you to compare them. His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable tension behind every word now. My grandmother's S in Brooks always loops up soft and wide like a ribbon. The signature on this withdrawal drags flat. Her L usually curves inward gentle like she's pulling her own name close. But this one, it flares outward, quick, almost angry. He took out 2 more notes, then a third and a fourth. She doesn't write like this, he said, gesturing to the forged page. Not when she's calm, not when she's being herself. He looked at the jurors again, one by one. I don't have a handwriting certification. I didn't run this through a lab. But I know what love looks like in ink. And this, he tapped the forged signature, isn't her. Keene stood sharply, his chair scraping against the polished floor. Oh, so now he's a handwriting expert too. This is laughable. What's next? DNA with crayons. There was a small murmur from the gallery, almost a chuckle, but it faded quickly. Because Elijah didn't take the bait. He didn't turn toward Keene. He didn't even blink. He just said, no. I'm not an expert. I'm just someone who's read her words more nights than I can count. And somehow that landed harder than any fancy credential could. He laid out 3 more signatures on the table, each one tied to a different transaction. Each one allegedly signed by Thelma. He explained the differences slowly, carefully. The spacing between letters, the slant of the T's, the consistent pressure in her natural signature compared to the erratic, uneven lines in the supposed authorizations. It's not just one forgery, Elijah said. It's a pattern. 4 signatures each linked to payments that don't make sense. Each one slightly different from the last. That's not how someone signs their name when they've been writing it the same way for 50 years. A hush settled over the room again. Even Judge Marlowe didn't interrupt. Not yet. Elijah leaned forward just slightly. If the signature is fake, then the authorization is fake. And if the authorization is fake, then someone else accessed those funds, which means we've been chasing the wrong person this whole time. Now he turned to Judge Marlowe. I know you can't take my word as legal proof. I know that. But I'm not asking you to rule. I'm asking you to look. You don't need a title to see what's right in front of you. He gestured gently toward the jury. They don't need a lab to tell them this signature isn't hers. All they have to do is trust what they see and what they feel in their gut. He stepped back, not dramatically, but with purpose. The silence that followed was heavier than before. One juror adjusted his glasses and leaned toward the document, studying them with new intensity. Another crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing slightly, not at Elijah, but at Keene. Keene looked toward the judge, frustrated, but he didn't stand again. From the gallery, Thelma sat still, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were moist, but her face was calm. Judge Marlowe finally spoke, her voice low and measured. Mr. Brooks, the court reminds you that analysis of this kind without expert validation remains speculative. Elijah nodded once. I understand. But Your Honor, sometimes the truth isn't just in procedure. It's in the details we overlook. The ones that don't come from books or titles, but from memory, from love, from what we know because we lived it. He turned back to the jury one last time. And when you've seen that truth, really seen it, you can't unsee it. He didn't need to say anything more. Because in that moment, it wasn't just about signatures. It was about trust. It was about doubt. And whether the people in that room were finally starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, the real crime wasn't committed by the woman on trial. The room had quieted again, but this time it wasn't the hush of curiosity. It was something heavier. Something like realization. Elijah stood still for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around him. Then slowly he opened another folder, thinner than the others, but with contents that felt heavier than any words spoken so far. This is a copy of my emergency room intake form. He began, holding the document with both hands. January 11th, 9:42 p.m. Severe asthma attack. Difficulty breathing. Loss of oxygen. I was brought in by a guardian listed as Thelma Brooks. He turned to the jury again, this time more gently. She was there the whole night. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, clearing his throat, but said nothing. Elijah continued. The withdrawal in question, the one for $3,000, was processed at 10:08 p.m. that same night. He passed the documents to the bailiff to be circulated. Then, without needing to dramatize a thing, he spoke the words that cut through the room more sharply than anything else had all day. I was gasping for air, and she was holding my hand. That's where she was. A single cough echoed from the back row. Nothing else moved. Keene stood up again this time with a printed exhibit in hand. There is no time-stamped photo, no camera proof. For all we know, she made the transaction, and came back. Elijah didn't flinch. He reached into his folder and held up a sheet. That's what I thought too. So I called the hospital. He looked directly at Judge Marlowe. I spoke with the head of security. The hospital's camera system stores backups for 90 days. They confirmed footage exists of my grandmother signing me and waiting with me and leaving after I was stabilized at 2:47 a.m. Keene interjected. Then why wasn't it submitted? Elijah's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Because I requested it as a minor. The footage was flagged for release only under subpoena. But the administrator wrote this letter. He held up the paper. It confirms the footage exists, and that it shows exactly what I've said. The judge nodded toward the bailiff, who retrieved the letter and handed it to her bench. She took her time reading it. Meanwhile, Elijah stepped back just slightly and looked to the jury once again. My grandmother's being accused of stealing that night. But the truth is, the only thing she was focused on was keeping me breathing. His voice dropped just slightly. I remember her hand wrapped around mine. Her whisper in my ear, telling me to hold on, telling me I wasn't alone. And then he did something unexpected. He sat down, not dramatically, not defiantly. He simply sat, and that somehow was more powerful than anything else he could have said. The room was still. The only sound came from the judge flipping the page of the administrator's letter, reading every word with more care than before. Keene adjusted his collar. He opened his mouth, but whatever argument he was preparing didn't come out. Because there wasn't one. Judge Marlowe finally spoke, her voice low but steady. We will recess for 20 minutes while the court verifies the contents of this letter. She struck the gavel, and in the space that followed no one moved, because the truth had entered the room quietly with no fanfare. Not in shouting, not in grand gestures. Just a boy with a document in one hand, and the memory of his grandmother's fingers wrapped tightly around his in the other. And for the first time since this trial began, the silence was not against him. It was standing with him. When the court reconvened, something had shifted. The walls hadn't changed, the people hadn't moved, but the air felt different, thicker somehow, like everyone had begun to truly listen. Elijah stood once more. He didn't bring a stack of folders this time. Just a single sheet folded once, clutched in his hand like a quiet weapon. I only have 3 questions for the prosecution. He said, his voice steady but no longer soft. Just yes or no. Keene leaned forward, his jaw already tight. The judge didn't stop him. She simply waited. Elijah turned toward him, looking straight into his eyes. Did your office request the IP address or login location associated with the online transaction that withdrew the money? Keene hesitated. We relied on account authentication. It's a yes or no question. Keene shifted again. No. Elijah nodded once. Did your office contact the financial institution to verify who physically received the funds? Another pause. No. And did your office subpoena or request the bank's surveillance footage for the time the withdrawal was made? Keene didn't answer immediately. His face said it all. No. Elijah took a small step forward, not aggressive, not performative, but deliberate. You charged my grandmother with a felony based on a name on a screen. You never confirmed where the login came from. You never asked who picked up the money. You never even looked at the camera footage that could have answered both. He turned to the jury, not to plead, but to lay out truth. This wasn't a mistake, it was a pattern. Keene tried to recover. We followed standard procedures. Elijah's voice didn't rise. That's the problem. He faced the jury fully now. Standard procedure should mean fairness. It should mean thoroughness. It should mean asking questions that challenge your assumptions, not reinforce them. He held the folded paper up. But what it meant here was skipping steps because someone with her face and her zip code with her income just looked guilty enough. A murmur stirred in the gallery, quickly silenced by the weight in Elijah's tone. I'm 12. I've never taken a law class, but I know what it feels like to be judged before anyone asks you who you are. He walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, letting the silence follow him. You didn't check the IP address because you thought the name was all that mattered. You didn't verify the receiver because you already decided who the criminal was. And you didn't ask for the footage because you didn't want to see anything that might make you wrong. Then he looked directly at Keene again. And if that's your version of justice, then the system's broken in ways you're too comfortable to admit. Keene opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Nothing would have mattered anyway. Elijah turned back to the jury. It wasn't just laziness. It was certainty. That's what bias looks like. It hides behind words like procedure and standard and probable. But what it really means is you didn't think she deserved better. He paused. Not because of the evidence, but because of who she is. Judge Marlowe's face was unreadable, but her fingers were no longer tapping the bench. She was listening too. And that's the mirror I want you to look into, Elijah said. Because this isn't just about Thelma Brooks. It's about every time a shortcut got taken because someone didn't fit the picture of innocent. He let the weight of that sit. Then without fanfare, he returned to his seat. No defiance. Just a boy with one sheet of paper and a truth no one could unhear. The courtroom sat still. No one spoke. Because for the first time, the silence wasn't working against him. It was working for him. Elijah had stared at the envelope for almost an hour the night it arrived. No return address, no markings, just a plain white seal. At first, he thought it might be a prank or a mistake. Maybe someone trying to scare him off again. But something about its weight felt different. There was purpose in the way it had been delivered. Not flashy, not loud, just waiting. And now standing into the center of that courtroom with every eye on him, he finally opened it. I received this anonymously, he said, holding up the sealed envelope. No name, no instructions. Just a recording. At first, I didn't know what it was or what it meant. But I listened. And I realized someone didn't just want me to know the truth. They needed me to say it out loud. He walked slowly to the court clerk's desk and handed over a flash drive. Judge Marlowe leaned forward, adjusting her glasses. Her fingers tapped once, then stopped. Even she could feel it. Something in the air had shifted. Keene rose before the file could be played. Your Honor, I object to the introduction of anonymous evidence with no chain of custody. This is improper. It's a recording from inside a public government office, Elijah said without turning. The City Hall policy states that non-confidential meetings may be recorded under transparency protocols. I checked. Twice. Keene scoffed. And now he's a legal expert too. No, Elijah said, finally facing him. I just read, and I pay attention when people don't think I'm smart enough to understand. The court clerk pressed play. At first, there was nothing, just faint shuffling. Then the unmistakable voice of Daniel Keene came through the speakers. We don't need this dragging out. Speed it up. I want this case done before the primaries. She's low-income, local, no legal team. It's a slam dunk. Just close it. You could feel the floor drop beneath that courtroom. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was paralyzing. Like everyone had inhaled at once and forgotten how to breathe. Elijah let the recording end naturally. He didn't add anything at first. He simply let the silence speak. Then he stepped forward. Let me repeat what you just heard, he said slowly. Speed it up. I want this case done before the primaries. He turned to the jury. Not search for the truth, not follow the evidence. Just finish it, fast, because it would look good on a campaign flyer. Keene's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He had turned red earlier. Now his face was pale. A woman in the gallery crossed her arms, staring at him with cold eyes. A man in the front row shook his head slowly. Even the bailiff looked uncomfortable. Elijah didn't stop. You see, my grandmother wasn't a defendant to him. She was a target, a convenient name on a folder. Someone who couldn't afford a lawyer. Someone no one expected to fight back. He walked up to the exhibit screen and pointed at the transcript now displayed from the flash drive. This wasn't incompetence. It was a choice. And not just one man's choice. A system's. Marlowe remained silent. For the first time, her usual posture of control had wilted. She looked aware. Like the armor she wore every day to court had finally cracked. Elijah looked directly at her now. You shut me down when I tried to speak. You dismissed my evidence before you even looked at it. You called my defense of her theatrics. He paused, then added, but I didn't come here to put on a show. I came here to make sure the truth had a voice. There was no shouting, no finger pointing. Just the clarity of conviction in a child's voice that had been tempered by grief, injustice, and love. I'm 12. I don't have legal degrees. I don't have campaign donors. I don't have power. He turned back to the gallery. But I do have memory. I have the sound of my grandmother's voice every Sunday night at that kitchen table, teaching me how to pay bills, how to read contracts, how to never sign anything I don't understand. He held up the sheet of paper that had come with the envelope. Just one line written in rushed handwriting. Speed it up. I want this case done before the primaries. This is what they wanted. Hidden, Elijah said. And someone risked something to send it. I don't know who, I don't know how, but I do know why. He paused again, because even in a broken system, someone still believed a child's voice could matter. You could feel it, an invisible shift in the jury box. Not all of them moved, but their faces did. The tension in their shoulders eased. Their eyes looked not just at Elijah, but through him toward something deeper. A truth they hadn't allowed themselves to fully admit until now. Keene slowly sat back down, not by order, but by gravity. His hands folded in his lap. His chin dropped to his chest. And Marlo, she stayed still, eyes locked on Elijah. Her silence was not neutral. It was loaded, measured. And for once it seemed she understood she had lost control not of the courtroom, but of the narrative. Elijah turned back to the front of the room and took a breath. I don't expect you to apologize. I don't expect you to say you were wrong. I just expect you to listen. Because if this courtroom isn't a place where truth can speak, then what is it? And with that, he stepped back. He didn't smile. He didn't bow. He just returned to his seat and sat beside the only person who had ever taught him what justice was supposed to look like. Thelma reached for his hand, and for the first time that day, Elijah let himself feel everything. The courtroom may have quieted, but outside the world was just beginning to roar. By the time Thelma and Elijah walked out those double doors, 3 local news vans were already parked at the curb. Reporters leaned forward like hounds catching the first trace of blood. Microphones rose before a single question had been asked. But neither of them stopped. Not because they were afraid, but because they both knew the real verdict wasn't written on paper. It was written in the eyes of every neighbor, every mother, every child who watched the story unfold that afternoon. Within hours, a clip of Elijah's words, "I just know what love looks like in ink," went viral. People didn't just share it. They clung to it. The internet moved quickly, faster than any judge's ruling. Hashtags appeared. So did phone calls. So did pressure. Keene's office was flooded by demands for resignation. His staff issued a statement calling the accusations deeply misleading and taken out of context, but it didn't land. Not this time. The audio was too clear, the paper trail too sharp, and the boy who exposed it all too unforgettable. Even Judge Marlo, whose gavel once silenced witnesses before they spoke, now faced questions from the State Judicial Review Board. Old cases were re-examined. Defense attorneys whispered about patterns they had ignored. A few even apologized, some publicly, most in private, for not pushing back sooner. And then something happened that no one had planned for. A group of high school students from the East Side kids Elijah had never met organized a rally. They called it Truth Has a Voice. Not a protest, not a riot, just a gathering. Dozens came, then hundreds. Some carried signs with Thelma's name. Others held up quotes from Elijah's speech. But what mattered wasn't the words. It was the feeling, the shift. Because for the first time, people weren't just angry. They were awake. They started asking questions. Not just about this one case, but about others. About funding. About the system. About how easy it was to believe a lie when it came from someone in a suit and tie. And how hard it was to hear the truth when it came from a child in sneakers and jeans. Elijah didn't ask for any of that. He wasn't interested in the cameras or the praise. He still took the same bus to school. Still sat by the window. Still looked down when too many people looked his way. But he noticed what was different. When his grandmother went to the store now, strangers smiled at her with something deeper than kindness. They nodded like they understood what she'd carried all those years. The weight, the loneliness, the fight. And when Elijah walked into class the next Monday, his teacher paused, just for a second, then said, "You don't just pass tests, Elijah, you set new ones." New. Back in court, the official proceedings were over. The file was sealed, but justice for once didn't stay locked behind a door. Thelma received a formal letter from the city apologizing for procedural misjudgment and reinstating her full standing in the Community Housing Board, though she declined the position. "I've served enough," she told Elijah quietly. "Now it's your turn to build." And Elijah just smiled, because he didn't need a title to keep telling the truth. The system shook, not because someone screamed, but because one small voice refused to stay silent. And when the people started listening, the silence finally broke. It wasn't about winning, not really. When Elijah finally sat down beside his grandmother again, long after the courtroom had emptied and the news trucks rolled away, he said it simply. I didn't fight to win. I fought so that the truth wouldn't die in silence. The room was quiet. Not the heavy kind of silence, but the soft kind. The kind that settles in when something broken finally begins to mend. And in the weeks that followed, something rare happened. Lawmakers, most of whom had never set foot in Elijah's neighborhood, stood in session chambers reading excerpts from his testimony. One representative, a woman from across the state, said, "We are not here today because a child wanted attention. We are here because a child reminded us how fragile truth becomes when power forgets who it serves." They called it the Elijah Act. It passed with a near unanimous vote, requiring physical presence verification for any transaction over $5,000 in community-managed funds. A simple change, but one that could have saved people like Thelma years of grief. Keene was indicted 2 weeks later. Wire fraud, misuse of office, evidence tampering. The charges stacked higher than his pride had ever allowed him to see coming. His press conference was short. No questions, no apologies. As for Judge Marlowe, he took early retirement, citing health reasons. But everyone knew it was the ethics board's review that pushed him out. Whispers in the halls spoke of decades of bias now impossible to ignore. No formal charges, no courtroom finale, just a nameplate taken down quietly on a rainy Tuesday morning. But the real ending didn't come in a headline. It came one night long after the noise had faded. Elijah sat on the porch with his grandmother, an old cassette player balanced on his lap. He had found the tape buried in a box of his mother's things. It clicked softly as it turned, and then his father's voice, rough and warm, came through. "You're gonna see a lot of unfair things, kiddo, but you don't measure yourself by what they do to you. You measure yourself by what you choose to stand up for." Elijah didn't speak. He just let the words sink in. When the tape stopped, he folded the player closed, stood up, and looked at his grandmother. "Let's go home," he said. And they did, not to forget, but to begin again, because justice had never meant punishing the wicked. It meant making sure the good were never silenced again. Sometimes justice doesn't come with headlines or handcuffs. Sometimes it starts with one quiet voice that refuses to back down. Elijah didn't speak up to win. He spoke up because silence was no longer an option, and in doing so, he reminded all of us what courage really looks like. This story is about love, truth, and the power of standing firm even when the odds are stacked high. It shows that no matter how small your voice may seem, it can still shake the walls of a broken system. If this story touched you, made you pause, or gave you hope, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to MMAX Stories. Your support means the world to us. Every comment, every share, every subscription helps us keep telling stories that matter. Stories that speak up when others stay quiet. Because here at MMAX Stories, we don't just tell stories. We make sure the truth gets heard. And we can't wait to share the next one with you.